Yeah. Okay. We started with a writer, and I think it's important that we close. I think we should close with another one. And the story goes that Senegal is buying back the library of one Leopold Senghor. So the article, it can be found in Radio France International, on the Radio France International website. And it's titled Senegal buys back library of poet president Leopold Senghor from France. There's a whole raft of history in this headline alone. More than 300 books collected by first president of independent Senegal, Leopold Sédar Senghor, will be transferred to Dakar after the Senegalese government stepped in to stop them being auctioned off in France. You can see an array of them. And in total, 344 volumes would leave the house in Normandy, where Senghor spent the final 20 years of his life, several of them personally inscribed by authors including Martinican poet Aimé Césaire. Along with Césaire and other African and Caribbean intellectuals, Senghor was one of the founders of the Negritude Black Consciousness movement, deeply problematic, in 1930 Paris. We didn't want to see the collection split up, given it includes works that document the emergence of the Negritude movement, said Céline Labrune-Bardien, a historian who helped coordinate an international project to inventory Senghor's archives. On the instructions of Senghor's heirs, his library was to go under the hammer at an auction house at the city of Caen in mid-April, divided into nearly 200 separate lots. But the newly elected president of Senegal, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, asked for the sale to be suspended while his government negotiated to buy the complete collection. What's your take?
Well, it's very ironic, but of course I support it and endorse it 100%.
The buyback?
The buyback. I'm happy to see that is being done.
Okay.
Of course, the irony is that this is a former president who sort of had the reputation of not only aligning himself politically very closely to the former colonial power of France, but also alleging cultural affinity between the two nations, almost to the detriment of celebrating African history and culture. So, of course, as you know, he later on became one of the most quote-unquote conservative of the post-independence African presidents on the continent. You could say that he was seen as the antithesis of Kwame Nkrumah, right? Where you have Nkrumah being the African nationalist, Pan-African, talking about African unity, taking control of our economy, our resources, which of course implies challenging Western dominance of Africa's destiny. But then on the other hand, you have on the opposing pole a person like Senghor, celebrating European culture, which of course implies acceptance of imperialism, and saying that we can actually develop and benefit from this mutual relationship between Africa, or between Senegal and France. And of course, it's really highly impossible to have mutual benefit when the economic relationship is one of exploitator, you see? So, and it's ironic that, as the article says, the last 20 years of his life, after he stepped down from as president, I believe it was in 1980 when he stepped down.
Correct.
The last 20 years of his life spent in France, not in his native
Senegal.
country of Senegal. But so at this point, I do not take a harsh view of him.
Mm-hmm.
I think his works are worth purchasing by the Senegalese state. Obviously, we have new leadership in Senegal, young leadership,
Mm-hmm.
including the new president, who is more oriented to the Kwame Nkrumah school of African
Young
politics,
leader. Yep.
Pan-African unity, taking control of our resources, taking control of our sovereignty, and so forth. But he is looking at Senegal. He's looking at Africa. This is a true Pan-African. He's not playing petty politics and saying, oh, you know, there are people who think Senghor was a reactionary, was a foundation for neocolonialism in Africa. No, he's looking beyond that. He's saying this was the first president of post-colonial Senegal. He was an intellectual. You cannot deny that. He was a poet, was considered to be high-caliber writer. So whether you agreed with him ideologically or not,
Yeah.
it is worth purchasing his archives because, and this to me is the most important part of it all, his archives and his notes and his correspondences will actually explain to us
his mindset,
what type of pressure he might have endured in order to make some of the decisions that he ended up making. So I see very informative books and writings coming out of owning this archives. And of course, this is very important not only to Senegal itself, but to other African countries where academics, intellectuals, and ordinary students want to learn the type of pressures that our post-colonial leaders endured, and how is it that we ended up with the current type of African states that we have.
And also, I would to buttress, to add to what you said there, it's also not only just the motivation in the political side, but also on the intellectual side, why he chose to concoct something that doesn't exist on the continent, that most of the intellectual class, the likes of Wole Soyinka, the likes of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe, push back upon. By that, I mean the negritude movement. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was the motivation behind Frantz Fanon writing Black Skin, White Mask. Because the finger was pointed, and every time I read it, especially the introduction, you begin to understand, these are the kind of people he was talking about.
Well, so the negative movement, I think it came under more disrepute much later. I think initially it was seen as something that was very welcome because they were promoting African writers, African poets, African arts. And then, of course, the criticism that came later was that they were trying to validate
the French.
They're trying to say, okay, Europe, you've shown us all these works of art and literature, and we can do it as well. And here's the proof. Here are the examples. But then, of course, the critique came from people that said, we don't need to validate. We had empires before some European nations, including England, existed. We built the civilization of Kemet, right?
Exactly.
Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Aksum, Nubia, right? Meroe, right? Congo Empire, right? So we had it all. There's no need for us to validate ourselves with a movement, right? So you can see how, when it first started, to many people, it had its appeal. And you can also see how the criticism that came later was also justified.
Funny enough, you should mention Kemet. The foremost authority on the African continent is also Senegalese.
Of
Check
course.
out Diop.
And the job.
Who he undermined.
Diop was treated very shabbily.
By him.
Absolutely. He was harassed, you know. He was politically persecuted, right?
Yeah.
Rather than celebrating and saying, you know what, we have an African genius. Can you imagine if he had the support of what he would have been able to accomplish, you know? Instead, they're saying, why is this African wanting to introduce a Pan-African language? Why is he making our European friends uncomfortable by telling them that ancient Kemet was actually Black African? Why is he reminding them that Africans existed, and then about 100,000 years ago, they migrated to other parts of the world, and over a period of 30,000 years, through climatic and environmental adaptation, they became people that eventually were known as Europeans, Asians, and so on and so forth. Senghor didn't like that. He was teaching people this because it made his European friends uncomfortable.
And also the fact
but
that
at the end of the day, I support what the current government is doing in Senegal. I think that is as Pan-African as it gets. We're saying we're looking beyond our ideological differences with Senghor. His materials are going to enrich our
African conversation,
collective knowledge, not only for Senegal but for Africa. So I support that 100%.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the article, not just as a lover of books, it's also the fact that you read both the people you agree with and those you disagree with.
I agree.
So,
and